100%, and it drives me absolutely crazy. I've had some quite brutal stand-up rows with people over this point.
Hello and welcome to Undocked. I'm Nick Chubb.
And I'm still Raoul Harris.
Hello, Raoul. How are you?
I'm a bit depressed this morning because
Oh, why?
summer's kind of ended, hasn't it? Like
Yeah,
a
it's
giant kind
grim.
bang. Really,
I saw you. Were you at Shoreham yesterday?
Yeah.
You look very moist.
I was soaked through to my absolute skin. I actually was going to mention this, but let's do it up front. A little feel-good story at the beginning.
Go on.
Down in Shoreham Port, there's the Galeon Andalucia,
Ooh.
which is a very faithfully, beautifully created Spanish galleon from what I guess would be, I don't know, somewhere in the 15. Well, they were in use, I think, between the 1500s and 1800s, that kind of thing. And there's a video on board there as well where you can see they actually built this with the original methods. So it's all hand carved and everything like that. So it's a beautiful, beautiful ship. And it was there for the weekend. I was busy at the weekend, but the appalling weather has detained it in port. So whereas everybody at the weekend was in this huge mush of people trying to look around this galleon, I went there yesterday in the driving rain and it was more or less empty. So, but it's fantastic. And it's still there. If you're listening, it will be there till Monday, I think. And on Monday, it's going to be exiting Shoreham Port. And I'm hoping that to sort of recreate that end scene from the Goonies, basically. That's what I'm thinking to do. So,
nice.
But anyway, there are serious people listening to this podcast, so we shouldn't dwell too much on the Goonies. Let me get stuck into story this week. You can tell things as well with the summer ending. You can tell sort of things are coming back to life in terms of people putting out press releases and all that sort of stuff. So our treading water through the summer months, it should start to be a little bit easier with some of these stories coming out. And one caught my eye. Is nothing better than when you kind of prophesize something, where you say, you posit an opinion and then somebody proves you right. And this is what I'm going to try and do with this next story. So this is a story of a partnership between ABB Marine and Walneus Marine, which is an arm of Williamson, I think. And they've launched basically a digital fleet optimization platform, but service. So this is kind of, we talk a lot about software as a service, and we talked about like the future of software as a service being to focus on the service. And then last week, I was saying I thought there was a huge amount of value in kind of people-heavy businesses attached to digital, because as AI becomes more and more capable of undertaking some of those more human aspects, we have this, if you like, this kind of potential roadmap towards being able to do more and more, either scaling up without scaling up the people, or indeed, let's face it, reducing headcount potentially in some of these businesses. Not suggesting that's what they're planning to do here, but what they're doing with this, and you often mention my branding, I quite like this one. They're calling it Oversea with the C, which I quite like. So it's a fleet support center fundamentally. So they're putting it's a sort of a digital platform, but it's like if you can imagine some of these companies setting up these digital control rooms. I think shout out to Columbia. They were certainly the first of the ones that I visited in Cyprus many years ago now. But this, this kind of shore operation, which looks very much like the bridge of a ship. So you can actually monitor all the vessels and that kind of thing. But clearly that is, a big operator kind of investment to do. And I guess these guys, my reading of this is that they're looking to supply potentially software, if you want to do that one, but also more of a kind of a service to be able to do the fleet monitoring and everything as a sort of an integral kind of service part of your operation. For me, I think this is a really interesting development. And there's not, masses amount of information at this point to see it, but the press release went out this week. And I think it's an interesting idea that more and more of these kind of as a service kind of critical functions are kind of plug and play sort of idea, I think is really interesting.
It kind of reminds me of, as you kind of maybe 10, 15 years ago, I think Carnival, one of the first to really kind of pioneer this space. And it really made sense in the cruise sector for a couple of reasons. One, just the safety aspect being the bar being so much higher for the cruise sector, but also that the cruise ships have had access to such good connectivity that it was actually kind of viable, and there was a willingness to make those levels of investment to build this stuff in house. And I thought back then actually it would be really nice to see this, kind of rolled out to the wider merchant fleet, but there's no way that the average ship owner would be able to afford to do it. So it's interesting to see that this is effectively becoming a third party service. And yeah, I really like the idea of it. It does raise questions to me, and we have a kind of contracted in support service, and the support service is advising me one thing, but I'm thinking another thing. Obviously the responsibility still lies with the master, but that question that we've talked about previously, where responsibility is increasingly moving further ashore, this feels like another step in that direction, which I think is probably a good thing if it genuinely relieves the responsibility or relieves the admin burden on the master. But I guess maybe that remains to be seen. It'd be interesting to have a proper deep dive on it.
I should say as well, just in case we're giving the wrong impression here, I'm not sure whether that's a service which talks directly to the vessel, or whether that's something that's handled. The relationship is with the shoreside. I don't know. It would make much more sense if it was working with the master. But I think there's a lot of things to unpack within what you're saying there, because I think one of the things I'll say sort of up front is that sort of, necessity is the mother of invention often with things, right? And the way that I see things developing for some time, it's looked like it would be more and more difficult to be a smaller operator and cover off all the things that you need to be able to cover off. When you look at things like Fuel EU and EU ETS, the complexity of all of those sorts of things, if you start to look at these fine margins that are going to make the difference between you hitting compliance targets on your use of carbon and all that sort of stuff, maybe if you've got like a few ships, it's actually okay to keep on top of it. There's going to be a break point though, between when you're sort of too big to really be able to keep a handle on it, but you're not big enough to put in place the headcount and the systems and all that sort of stuff to do it. So I think there is going to emerge that sweet spot where there are people who are going to want to come in and offer those kind of services. But then, exactly as you say, there's then that sort of delegation of responsibility, I guess, without delegation of the what's the word for it, the sort of culpability, or the true responsibility in terms of the legal aspects of it. And I think that's one of the things that is a real pinch point anyway, when you start to look at ships, the kind of ship that I was just talking about, this completely autonomous, within its own. Autonomous is a very loaded word for ships these days, but they were completely separate, right? The captain on board, the crew, uncontactable, going, across the oceans.
Yeah.
And the captain is responsible for every single soul on board that vessel and makes all of the decisions. And we're now in a position where the master is still going to be the one that ends up in court, still going to be potentially criminalized by actions, but is actually increasingly disempowered in terms of making all of the decisions and calls, because there's lots of very clever people and systems that are starting to dictate what they want to see happen. And I think that's, again, is a sort of massive friction point within this whole kind of idea, really.
Yeah, I think it's a big risk with the way these systems are moving, is that and this happens all the time, right? Technology moves faster than regulation. And we're at a point now where technology has enabled, if not decision making, then decision support to move ashore in a way that regulation just does not allow for. And you're absolutely right. I think the pressure that potentially puts on masters in particular, but also all of the kind of senior officers on board, I imagine, not having done it, but I imagine would become something that could be quite unbearable if it's that responsibility without empowerment. That's a really horrible place to be. Responsibility with empowerment is a great place to be.
Yeah, I think in general life, that's one of the biggest sources of stress is having the responsibility but not having the agency. But I think just to kind of come back to the story there, that operational performance thing is going to be a series of kind of leading and lagging indicators as well. And this kind of comes back to I think one of the other things that we've talked about quite a lot here, and I know you personally hold the same view. There's this risk at the moment that we've got all this data coming in, but if you're not actually able to learn anything from that data and really understand what you should be changing and making, what moves you should be making as a result of that, then it's really not adding any value at all. So I think, again, this is a potential area where these kind of services could add quite a lot of value, is being able to say, look, this is what we're seeing. This is also what the market is seeing, or what we're seeing in the market, sorry, in the overall data picture from a benchmarking perspective. And these are the things that you could be doing that could enable you to better perform. And this, again, speaks to that vendor advantage. We've talked a couple of times around the temptation to build all your own software, do it yourself, be in complete control, versus, what are the advantages that the vendors have going forward. And obviously, if you've got that whole market sweep of data, you are able to add that level of consultancy where you're actually making those recommendations on what you see as best practice that people are doing. So again, I thought that was an interesting dimension too.
That whole drowning in data, starved of insight piece, I think it's increasingly where things are going. Even, for us, we're a very small business, but we have the potential to pick up so much data about our customers. Data, I mean, obviously we collect a lot of data for research purposes, but actually picking through it and working out what is valuable is as much art as it is skill. And it's really, really difficult to do sometimes. And what you don't realize is that over years, it creates a massive cost drag, bringing all this data in. And if you put it into the context of a ship, by the time you've got the kind of sunk cost of installing IoT devices all across the ship, running cables, all of that sort of stuff, then you've got the cost of sending the data ashore, then you've got the cost of processing the data, then you've got the cost of data warehousing. Easily can stretch into high 5 figures per vessel, if not 6 figures per vessel. And unless you're getting X5, X10X that back in better decision making, it's just not worth it. And so I think sometimes everyone gets very excited about new software being rolled out across the fleet. And, that's the stuff that we see on Digital Ship performs really well. And I think there's an element of FOMO to it, that ABC shipping companies rolled out some particular piece of tech. But sometimes I think actually you do just have to really take stock of where you're at before you make a decision to go after the next thing and get the next bit of data. That said, I think a fleet performance service, I think, is a really clever idea. I'll be interested to see how it develops.
Yeah, just on your point of data, because this is this shout out to KD Adamson, who did she did a nice presentation for us at an OTG conference we did last year, and she has a very good angle on data, and she says something about we have a lot of dead data and we spend a fortune tending the grave. To your point,
That's really good.
Yeah, I'm sure all of us are hanging on thinking that we've got this sort of precious data that we might do something with. It's a bit like your loft, isn't it? Your loft is full of things you probably won't see again until you move house next time. You just take it in boxes to the next house and then put it in the loft.
So when we lived in London, we lived on a boat, and we moved from a house to a boat. And so we had to put a load of stuff in storage, because obviously boats are not very big. And we had a storage unit that we kept for all the stuff that would have, furniture and things from the house. And we said, we're going to sell it all. We're going to sell all the furniture. We're going to sell all the stuff. And we'll make our money back easily. And then we kind of sat down after like 2 or 3 years this had gone on and we hadn't sold everything and we were still paying for this storage unit. We sat down and did the maths of working out how much we'd paid for this storage unit. And it got into like the thousands of pounds. And then we sat and then we opened the storage unit and looked at the furniture and we're like, there's no way we're making our money back here. We need to just cut our losses and get rid of the storage unit.
A metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Declutter. Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I think it'll be interesting to see, won't it? Because this is the thing is, all these really brilliant, sort of clever people developing software, going to customers and listening to their pain points and then developing this software. There's very, very rarely that kind of focus on how to make a success of it once it's implemented. But in my experience, success or failure normally comes down to the champion in the business that's able to really take it on and really bed it in, get people to adopt it, see it through. So it would not surprise me as these software systems become more and more complicated as well, and the whole landscape becomes more and more complicated, it wouldn't surprise me if there is this increasingly big sort of service element to the things. And of course, agents have AI agents have the potential to make that kind of bring that cost base down. But I think that, yeah, it'd be interesting to see. We've got fleet optimization on the one hand here, obviously supply chain, the whole sort of logistics side, the brokering side of it. I think that's kind of potentially quite a big area. And of course, the whole crew space, which is really interesting as well. So, yeah.
On the topic of cost drag and not really thinking about how your costs are escalating when it comes to software, can I give you a little non-maritime story that I saw?
I always like a non-maritime story. So
I
please.
thought you would. So I read last week that Microsoft has decided to scrap volume discounts for enterprise customers.
Wow.
So ordinarily, if you're taking 1,000 licenses for Office 365 or whatever, you get quite a hefty volume discount as part of your contract. And also if you do things like, extending the contract out over a number of years, they've now moved to a model where no matter how many licenses you're taking, it's kind of one size fits all, one price fits all. And they've done this very quietly. And the way that these renewals work is obviously, you might sign a contract that will last for 3 years. And so the kind of ripple effects of this are only just starting to come through, where people are realizing they're coming up to their renewal date. They're getting new quotes through that are significantly higher than what they had previously signed up to with the volume discounts gone. And it's causing just an absolute panic within procurement teams, budgets having to be totally scrapped and redeveloped and all this sort of stuff. And it got me thinking about renewal strategy generally, and how it's so easy to just drift into your next contract, particularly if it's a software that you rely on operationally. And Microsoft obviously is a great example of that. The inertia of moving to a new supplier is so high that and that renewal date just ticks down, 90 days, 60 days, 30 days, shit, it's next week. You just have to sign, and then your budget's just totally destroyed. So I thought it was a really interesting thing about actually getting ahead of renewal decisions and getting and having a really good procurement strategy in place, because I think most organizations don't.
Yeah. But also it's something that's very difficult to get right when you're doing your pricing strategy as a vendor as well. And it really does bear thinking about, particularly in a global business like shipping, particularly if you're pricing perhaps in dollars, because that tends to be the way that we do pricing in shipping industry, but your cost base is in another currency. Now, obviously the dollar for a very long time, extremely stable as the kind of de facto world currency. That's gone out of the window now. You've seen the kind of changes that just on currency alone could hit you to, I think it's crazy. I think it's like 20-30% or something like that. Somebody I was chatting to works in the FX side of things. So, so it means even if you're relatively small, you've got to make sure that you're doing things like hedging on currency and things like that. You've got to think about inflation. And if you want to get into rolling contracts, how are you going to try and build that in, and not what would be acceptable to the customer? Are you going to sort of say, it's if you don't cancel, it's a rolling contract. But if you don't include some sort of pricing mechanism in that, you're effectively cutting your prices and your cost base is probably going up. So another thing to think about, just anecdotally, when I mentioned the other week, when I became MD of Videotel, suddenly I've been working there a very long time, sat down with the finance director, and we suddenly saw this kind of sudden drop. And I was like, what's happened here? Quite a substantial amount of money that had just fallen off the balance sheet. And it turned out to be exactly that. It was a contract which had just run out, so they stopped paying.
Wow.
And it didn't have within it, I should hasten to add that the standard contracts, this was not a standard thing at all. It was a very niche contract.
Yeah.
And I was completely unaware of it. No one else had been when it was signed. It had been like a 5-year deal or something like that. And then, of course, you've got to go back. And luckily, we were able to get the service back up and running. So the situation there was, customer was perfectly happy to carry on with the service. Contract said no,
finished.
so therefore they stopped paying. So therefore, it's a sudden drop off. So these are, I would expect people to kind of figure that out. But it's just something to think about. Sometimes in the sugar rush, it's like, oh yeah, great, it's a 5-year contract. Yeah. But at some point, what's going to happen there is, and you've got to stay on top of it. And also as well, like inflation at the moment, looking at it globally, how do you build that into your contracts and that sort of stuff? So yeah, just from a vendor's point of view, if you are kind of starting out or you're revisiting your pricing and stuff, the currency thing, I think, is something as well most people might overlook and can be a really, really big issue.
Well, just from the just to kind of give a buyer's counterpoint to that as well, I guess, is that I think it's really important, whoever your software vendors are, that you know who you could turn to if you wanted to get out of that contract. And you also know what the process would look like to do that, right? So if you end up with a piece of software that is so embedded in your operations that you end up having to unpick loads of APIs and you don't even know which bits are going to break if you turn off this piece of software, there's just no chance you'll ever switch it off. You are beholden to the supplier at that point.
You won't be making many friends in the vendor community. Now, Microsoft is something it's really in that business critical space, right? It's called Microsoft Office for a reason, right? It's just your digital bones of your office. People don't want to really be thinking about that. So I think once that's in, if the pricing, unless something crazy happens to the pricing, much to Elon Musk's chagrin with his macro hard we talked about last week, coming in and trying to win that business, most people are just going to stay with that because they've got better things to be thinking about and much more exciting software that could be transformative to their business. So that's something that you would just get perhaps more and more embedded in without even really thinking about it. They're reliable. And then they do something like this, which is massively disruptive, changing your business model, your pricing model, your strategy for dealing with enterprise customers. Moreover, doing that kind of like, let's just slip that out, see what we can get away with, make me really, really angry and really, really nervous about how embedded we were. And when you think about the ways in which these software relationships get arms and legs, look at that from Microsoft Office point of view. Have I got a problem switching out email client? No, not really. Can I use a different document? Yeah, there's probably other people. But once you start kind of using things like Teams and Copilot, and you've got maybe some Azure and the server structures and security and all of those kind of things in there, before you know it, your dependency level is very high. And my cynical guess would be that this change in how they deal with enterprise customers, they're doing from a position of confidence that people are so embedded that they can really do what they want. And that would make you feel very, very vulnerable, I think, as a man.
Yeah. It's very, very true. I mean, I think turning this into a advice for small businesses, which is a real pivot, but here we go. The biggest lever you can pull is price. And what you tend to find is if you're operating at a relatively low margin, and this is not the case for Microsoft, so I just can't quite work out the logic for why they've done this. But if you're operating with quite low margins, the best, and you've got good demand for what you're doing, the best thing you can do is raise your price, because it increases your margin and probably will turn away those who only buying from you because of price rather than because of what you do or the quality of what you do. And it is kind of, at a larger scale, it's the kind of PE playbook as well. And we've seen this in the maritime sector. Lots of maritime software vendors, some have been doing double-digit price rises when contracts come up year on year. And that is a big lever to how they're growing organically. But I am shocked to see this at the kind of enterprise level for an organization as big as Microsoft. But I guess, everyone's got earnings targets to hit, right? And that's potentially a short-term win that could have long-term consequences, because it does open the door for the likes of a macro hard.
Yeah. But I think the thing about Microsoft is when you are so embedded as they are, I think arguably you should have a sense of duty and a sense of responsibility, because they are an institution, right? They're kind of part and parcel of everything. I think there should come with that a sense of responsibility. And I think that's kind of, again, that speaks to the sort of things that are very dear to me, like your brand and how seriously you take that, because that's a very privileged position to find yourself in. It takes a lot of investment from all of your customers. And if you abuse that, you can very, very quickly become the enemy in people's minds. And if you do that, sooner or later, you will fail.
Let me give you the counter to that. There are many, many great institutions in history that have possibly gone against their own interest because they are great institutions and have subsequently died. And Microsoft is in an arms race right now with Meta, Google, Alphabet, whatever you want to call it. You've got whatever Elon Musk is up to, that they are trying to win this AI race. And to do that, it takes enormous amounts of capital. And obviously they have good capital raising abilities. They're a public company, all of that sort of stuff. But also, the best way to get your hands on cash quickly is to do something like this. And so you could easily make the counter argument that in the rise of a major technological shift, not doing something like this may lead to their decline more rapidly than doing it. I'm not necessarily saying it's a good idea, but I'm trying to put myself in their shoes in terms of kind of what's going on in the wider picture. Like, it used to be the dominant supplier in this space, but I think actually a lot of small businesses now use Google. We use Google. I made a very conscious decision never to use Microsoft when we first started out. And I can see a world where if they don't react, they will eventually start to get disrupted.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that's good. There's a good challenge there. I think you're right. I think behind it is something to do with that arms race that you mentioned. But I think there is perhaps also thinking beyond the kind of service that they offer today, because the way things are bundled could change substantially in the future. And it makes more sense to them to look at it as an individual license thing. But just to come back to bring it back to shipping as well, I think, and again, sort of helpful advice for how people approach this. There's always, we've always priced things per ship in shipping, haven't we? That's been the sort of the way that we've done things. And often it's not based on a user model. Vendors might not always be aware of how many people are on board a ship and stuff like that, but they know how many ships there are. They can scale things, they can measure that. And the number of ships accessing your service is a sort of a vanity metric that we use to kind of have an idea of the scale. But clearly, once you start to move to cloud, the user model makes much, much more sense. And if you take the Videotel example, it was a box that you put on the ship and you didn't really care how many people accessed it. That's how you worked it. Everyone sat at a terminal. If they're then accessing that on mobile phones and at home, and it becomes a user one-to-one relationship. And then you have to look at how that then changes your business model. And it can be very, very tricky. And sometimes there's unintended consequences that can happen when you shift to another model, and people say, oh, it turns out I don't need as many of those as I thought I did because I only want these 4 people to actually, access this. So it can change things quite quickly and you can end up causing yourself some problems. And that's why sort of really doing some solid work on your pricing models, as well as looking ahead and looking at the way in which the software market is developing and really thinking through all those things, because it can be very tricky if you then have to do a big dramatic move like the one we're just discussing now, because it does shake the ground.
Yeah. Should we talk about something that isn't AI, isn't IT? I think you had another interesting story that was ammonia related, right?
But yeah, again, sort of hark back, episode 1, we talked about ammonia, and ever since Nor Shipping back in June, I think steadily, news has come out about ammonia. So I was interested to read, Japan delivers world's first commercial ammonia fueled engine. This was a story in Splash, and this is a dual fueled HFO and ammonia engine to be delivered in October 2025. Now, I won't claim to be 100% on top of this, but yes, there are ammonia fueled vessels at the moment. I don't think any of them are sort of the big commercial ships. I think there's tugs for sure, and I think some smaller vessels as well. So I think this is why this is an important announcement and why they're being able to claim, we are proud to deliver the world's first safe and reliable ammonia fuel engine to the market. This is J-Eng in Japan. So really interesting. It's, as I said, coming in October, and this is for a new build, which is going to be delivered in 2026. I think what's really interesting about that is it sort of brings into stark reality the fact that although these are small numbers of ammonia fuel chips, they're going to be there next year. And this was something that was very, very abstract, I think,
Yeah.
even a couple of years ago. You know, the debate was like, you know, what's the fuel of the future going to be? And it might be this and it might be that. And methanol, we know, moves ahead a little bit with methanol. But this makes it very real. And there are other people who've committed to getting vessels on the water within that time frame. So the simple point I wanted to make is that ammonia is now here, right? And that means that we have to make sure that there's a workforce that are ready to actually do it. And that reminded me of the work of friends at the Just Transition Task Force. And I don't know, have you heard of the Just Transition Task Force?
I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it does. Enlighten me.
Well, it's really good. So my connection with it started at the COP that was in Glasgow. And at that time, the discussion was all about like the vessels, the infrastructure, the engines. What are all the technical aspects that will be needed to be able to get this to it? So we started discussions at that point with the Nautical Institute and asking them about sort of training standards, and that discussion led to Nautical Institute publications called the Green Curriculum, which was looking at competency frameworks around it, but also started talking within that discussion with the ICS. And that's when ICS said, well, actually, we're working on something, perhaps you'd like to get involved, which was ICS, ITF, and the UN Global Compact working together on exactly this, how we were going to prepare the workforce. And their big thing is the just transition. So not only how are we going to have a workforce that can work with these new fuels safely, but how are we going to do that equitably? Because we've got a very delicate balance at the moment in the way that the things are set up with crew centers, for example, Manila, of course, India, established kind of places in the global south. How are we going to make sure that they're part of this journey?
This is kind of the idea that there's no point in just Norway going green, right?
Yeah, but also as well thinking about like if let's say, for example, to work with ammonia, you needed to put in this huge amount of investment in training and in the infrastructure to support that training. So it's looking at it much more saying, well, what's the existing map look like, and how do we actually make sure that everybody can come with us? And that means, but apart from anything else, my background in training, the way that this needs to work is before you can really do anything, you have to understand what the standards are that you're looking for. Because if you don't have an agreed standard, what happens is every supplier of training needs to decide for themselves what they think is the most important things that need to be learned to work safely with it. And of course, you've got vessels on multiple, companies on the water. If they've all got a slightly different idea, one, it makes it very difficult from a seafarer mobility point of view, but it also, for example, going into different ports, they've got to think about, well, what's this training standard and understand that.
Yeah.
And, all of that. It becomes impossible, really, and you don't get any benefit from economy of scale. So starting with the standards, and that's where something like STCW had been so effective. It set a single minimum standard. Things like IMO model courses, for example, they're very useful as well in kind of saying like, these are the things that must be in there. And then training suppliers, be they traditional training suppliers or digital training suppliers, can look at those standards. They can see what must be covered in the course. They can see what learning outcomes must be delivered. And that then enables everybody to know where they stand, and it enables flags to approve training providers because they have some mechanism to do that. So hugely complicated thing really to kind of get right and to get agreement on, which is why institutions like IMO are so important, because they have that internationally agreed local kind of legislation aspect. So that's why updating training standards to STCW is something that's fundamental to the evolution of new fuels training. But, and this is the problem, getting all those countries to agree on anything moves at a very slow pace. And we're in a very fast moving, it might not feel like it, but the transition to new fuels is moving much faster than we're perhaps used to in a legislative sense. And so we don't have those published standards. So this is really what the work of the Just Transition Task Force has really been about. It's about pulling together. So DNV were involved, Lloyd's Register, decarbonisation through their decarbonisation hub, but also through the Charitable Foundation have been a big supporter of this as well, in both in terms of funding and in expertise. Ocean Technologies Group that I was working with, a partner there, and so I became involved in that work through the peer learning group, and through that, looking at developing competency standards for methanol, hydrogen, and ammonia as well. And that work has been ongoing. So starting out with sort of setting out some guidelines, which were published, and we launched that at Crew Connect last year. I moderated that session when we looked at that, and they're released this summer much more detailed guidelines around what needs to be included in the training. And they're actually going to be covering that. Sort of shout out to friends at Lloyd's Register who are doing a human capital management event forum, human capital management forum, out on the Wednesday at let's have a look, 2:30 to 5:30 at the Lloyd's Register building. So they're going to be looking at sort of more broadly at human capital management, but within that program, there's a session by the Maritime Just Transition Task Force where they'll be talking about these standards. And the idea there is really that this is something that could be then picked up by the traditional training providers, who would then be responsible for the delivery. So this isn't a commercial product. This is something that guides those that wish to deliver that training effectively.
You probably don't know, I'm probably asking an unfair question, but this particular announcement of an ammonia dual fuel engine that's going to be on the water next year, do we know or have any kind of sense of what training the crew are going to be doing that's different? Like they may well try to adopt that standard, but I guess there's no real way of knowing. And I don't know, I guess, does this come back to class? I assume it will come back to class and flag to actually sign off that whatever's been done is okay in the
Yeah. So exactly that. You've got a specific vessel and what is in place to run that. And normally the way this works, as you will know, is you've got class and flag who are basically looking at all the different dimensions, the ship construction, the way it's put together, all of that, the maintenance routines, and all of those sorts of things go into kind of deciding whether this is safe and seaworthy and all that kind of stuff. And there's always a bit of it which is the sort of like let's say is not satisfied by the kind of technical systems or that sort of stuff. The human operational bit. Okay. And then there'll be certain processes that are sort of signed off that will be followed. And those will be kind of written into the procedural manual or whatever, the safety management system. But there's always going to be a bit which is going to be dependent on and there's sometimes a bit of a risk. I know people have raised it with me that they kind of feel slightly dissatisfied that it's a bit of a get out of jail card, that you can always lump something into, this is a risk which needs to be mitigated.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll just make sure people have to, learn how to deal with that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and you're not overloading people in that regard. So yeah, I think the thing to look at this is, I mentioned that the Just Transition Task Force is looking at, methanol, hydrogen, and ammonia. It's worth remembering methanol ships have been on the water for a while now. Maersk have been using methanol ships, and they clearly have developed their own training frameworks to satisfy the needs.
Yes and no. Like, methanol ships have been on the water technically for a few years, but they're not being fueled by methanol. And this dual fueled ammonia ship almost certainly will not be fueled by ammonia when it first hits the water.
Well, there is that. I think ammonia is very different in that, we've talked about this in previous episodes. You've got ammonia as cargo, which has all sorts of safety considerations and procedural things that need to be done and understood about it as a cargo. The potential for it to be in the engine space by virtue of being a fuel is a very different proposition. So I don't have the technical competence to know whether, if you're operating it under HFO, but you've got that sort of connection to potentially in the fuel space. I don't know really whether that means that that's something we worry about later. But the implication must surely be that if you're going out with it, like, for example, let me give you a very simple illustration of where it would be different. If you have dual fuel ships with LNG, HFO LNG at the moment, you are going to have, you are going to have the training in place to be able to have
Yeah.
IGF code training. You can't say, well, actually, I don't plan on using that bit. So I think the implications from a training perspective are the same. So it's kind of, you're right. It's down to to class and to flag to decide whether or not that's safe, and be satisfied that the safety side of things is in place. But then that will still involve a determination around who can operate that vessel. And that's where the training thing becomes important as well. So like I mentioned there, you can be on that vessel and working on that vessel, but you have to have sea time. You have to have these additional certificates. You have to have, and that can be quite tricky for people to ensure, because you've got to have an extra, highly paid crew member on board who's really just kind of observing while they kind of gather that sea time. I think the thing to bear in mind here is, once these standards are there, and the training can then be designed and then delivered, there is going to be a big change in the way that we deal with that. Because I've said it before and I'll say it again, the seafarer of yesterday training the seafarer of tomorrow is going to come under massive, which is the model we have today, is going to come under massive strain when there's no one that's worked in this. And B, a lot of these new fuels, ammonia as fuel, it's not just going to be confined to maritime, or hydrogen, or any of these new fuels and green technologies that we're employing. Those are going to be in use by industry. They're going to be very attractive. People with those skills and that knowledge are going to be very, very attractive beyond maritime, let alone within maritime. And so it is going to come under massive strain. And I think that one of the things that's going to be required is we're going to have to think very carefully about how we design delivery of learning and how we think about that to be able to do it and employ it at scale. And this is one of the reasons why the revision to STCW is so important, because it was written in the 70s, right? It's been amended since, but the fundamentals of STCW was a completely different world, right?
Yeah.
So it didn't think about VR, it didn't think about AI, it didn't even probably really think that much about simulation as we know it today. And so we need to be able to bring people massively up to speed with what can be done. We need to get the whole industry to be really focused on learning outcomes, because I'm not saying everything can be delivered digitally, but I am saying that we have to make it work. And if we don't think about how we can scale things up, how we can leverage all of the technologies at our disposal, not to compromise on safety at all, but to actually think about the kind of way we design learning so we can maximize the resources that we have.
Isn't the IMO working on a set of amendments at the moment?
Yes. Yeah. And this work is going into that. But I think the problem that we've got is that the revision to STCW, 2035 would be optimistic in my view. Certain people disagree with me and think it can be done earlier, but to get it to the point where it's actually rolling out and bedded in and everything's dealt with. But of course there is guidance that can be published in the interim, and there can, for example, relations to IGF code, for example, that's a way of taking an existing instrument and pushing it forward. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, but I think that changing things piecemeal doesn't quite often deliver you the kind of the major sort of change that you need, which kind of brings me to another interesting thing that I saw on your publication, Digital Ship, actually, which was good, which was about the update to the DNV simulator training standards.
Oh yeah.
So periodically, again, we talked about then, you talked about the role of class also plays an important role in these kind of frameworks to be able to have some benchmark of quality that can be measured against in terms of delivery. And I think that's really, really interesting, because I think there are a lot of people out there in the operating ship management owner community, people who are working with crews who want to embrace technology, but they have some reservations around knowing for sure as they step forward that things are of a significant quality. Let me give you a simple example. simulators have been in use for a very long time, the kind of bridge simulators that you will have used, Nick, where it's
Yeah.
a
You're in a
good
massive room.
approximation of the bridge. You're working side by side with other maritime professionals. You've got the equipment where you expect the equipment to be. And there's always an instructor present, by the way. And the assessment is very much kind of person to person, let's say. And people are very comfortable with that. Once you start to say, well, hang on a minute, we can actually run these simulators online. We can run these simulators, in the cloud. And that was a big, big change. People like Wärtsilä pioneering with that, and others as well. But there's some nerves there around, well, how does that change things, in terms of, does that delivery change actually, is that actually changing the experience and the knowledge that people have got? And these are right questions to have. And I think, so these kind of standards are really, really important, that we evolve them, and that we, as we get the technological changes and the possibilities open up, that we really make sure that we're doing that in a way that focuses on the quality of the delivery, and a stress again, the outcome of the learning, what is actually picked up.
Have you heard of Kilo Solutions?
I have, although I thought it was Kylo.
Oh, really? It's so funny. We often pronounce things very differently, you and I, and
Yeah.
it's one of those things that you always just say in your head unless you're speaking to the people. But so they have a simulator called Vasco, which they call Vasco is the Virtual Advancement System for Competent Operations, which I must admit makes it sound quite dull, but it's actually really cool. What they've done is they've created a cloud-based virtual reality simulator that does a bridge and engine room simulator, and it's effectively multiplayer, for want of a better way of describing it. So you can have multiple people on the bridge of this one simulated ship, and you can have multiple people in the engine room of this one simulated ship, and you can have multiple ships with other real people on them, all in one kind of virtual environment. And everything can be done as cheaply as you can get those VR headsets that you can just put your iPhone into or your Android phone into, and then it just runs on the cloud in a web browser. And it's pretty good. It's not quite the same as something that would be a full-blown class-approved replication of all the equipment on board, but that's not what it's for. The aim of the simulator is to replicate bridge resource management, and how individuals on a team interact in a stressful situation or in a collision situation. And so what they've really put the focus on is things like the kind of hydrodynamics and how the vessel moves through the water and how the vessel handles. And they put the focus on making sure that you can have this multiplayer environment where you've got potentially lots of ships, a high traffic environment that is quite high risk. And you can put a team of 2, 3, 4 people really through their paces in quite a safe and very cheap way, wherever they are in the world, as long as they've got an internet connection. And the thing I like about it is it's just such a pivot from what you were talking about earlier with the kind of big simulators that where you go into a room and you've got one instructor and it's just kind of one environment, and it's very good, but relatively static, and it relies on a very, very expensive piece of kit, whereas this is just totally turned on its head. So it's very cool, and it does some really interesting stuff.
That's a really good example of even you and I, as people who are very steeply bedded in sort of technology, we would still need to kind of dig into that and understand what's actually going on there, and the experience of the learners and all that sort of stuff. So people that are kind of unfamiliar with that quite often would hear that and just kind of shut down. They would be like, oh my God, I don't even want to think about this. And this is really the point, is that very often there's a lot of these great things you can do, but what will often come down to the big question in the person paying for it wants to know is, will this be accepted by flag? Will it be accepted by class? Can I do this instead of the other thing that I'm already doing? Because if it's just an extra, then no thanks. And that's the risk. And that was my experience when I was pioneering VR. It was one of the issues. It actually replicate or take the place of something else. Which is why it's really important that we bring everybody up to speed with what the technology can actually do, and look at learner pathways that can kind of get us to that. And just to kind of help people here, if you've got a 5-day attendance course, and the first 3 days, for example, you're sitting in a room listening to someone doing PowerPoint presentations, you could take that component out, deliver that in a more effective and scalable way, and then just have the 2 days where they're actually doing the kind of interaction piece or whatever, for example. So there are ways that we could intelligently do this, but I think that the standards thing is really, really important to come back to to things like the DNV standard, because the concern is that in the use of the technology, something is being lost. Now, let me just make it a little bit easier for people to talk about it from a classroom perspective. Everyone's familiar with the idea that you might have 20 people in a class listening to an instructor. If I said to you there's going to be 150 people in the class, you would say, well, there's no way that anyone's going to have that same quality of experience. And this is often the problem when we scale things to online, because you can have 150 people. Oh, great, let's do that. And again, it may be, if it's a lecture, who cares how many people are in the room? That's not the important thing. But if the important thing is that the tutor is eyeballing people, is asking them to contribute things about their experience, he's challenging them to be involved and to be interactive, then that's really important that that's protected. But, and this is where I flip it back, is to say that you will not guarantee that by it just being physical instead of being virtual.
Yeah.
There are plenty of classrooms you could go in where there'll be 30 people asleep and someone just talking at the front, as well. It doesn't guarantee interaction. And that's why when we write standards and we talk about learning outcomes, that's what we really want to see protected. Is it actually having impact, and are the right things happening in the learning, regardless of how it's delivered?
I think one of the interesting and slightly frustrating things about this is how often funding is tied to things like contact hours. So in the UK, I'm going to misquote the numbers, so please don't come at me if I get this wrong, but something like the funding for the cadets is tied to a specific number of contact hours, like 240 contact hours or something over 3 years.
Yeah.
And if the colleges don't deliver that, they can't draw down the funding. And if they can't draw down the funding, the courses are totally not viable. And so you end up in this really stupid kind of cat and mouse where actually there are possibly much, much better ways to deliver the training, to deliver the education, I should say, the educational content. You could take a 40-hour course and turn that into 40 hours worth of lectures that could be delivered online and recorded once. And then every time that cohort runs, you've freed up the lecturer's time for 40 hours that they can spend one-on-one with students to understand their knowledge, see where their problems are, all of that sort of stuff. But then that reduces each individual student's contact time. And so the only way it becomes workable to be able to get the funding is that you have to just shove everyone in a room. Like everyone just has to be in the room, whether learning takes place or not. And it's such an inefficient model that it really kind of boils my blood, because we're just chasing funding for no good reason. There are so much better ways to do this stuff, but we're kind of hamstrung by what the governments around the world and regulators say.
Yeah, 100%. And it drives me absolutely crazy. I've had some quite brutal stand-up rows with people over this point where they've said, but how can you prove that they spend 15 hours? And I say, I don't care how long they spend. It doesn't matter how long they spend. It's irrelevant. It's completely and utterly irrelevant. You're managing input.
Yeah.
That's it. You're not, and it goes to the same thing about, it's not interactive. It's like, I've seen classrooms, it's not interactive. It's down to the quality of the delivery, down to the outcomes being achieved. We learn at different paces. It's just that move really it's a little bit like the same dilemma that anybody has had in shifting to remote working. It's a lot easier to manage. Did everyone arrive at a building at 9 o'clock and leave at 5 o'clock? Great. What they did when they were there, who knows, how much work they did. But it's an easy measure. So it's an easy one. And lots of employers want to see people back in the office because it's just something that they can very simply understand. Versus, what do I actually want people to achieve? Output. What do they generate? And a really progressive employer will say, well, as long as they achieve what I expect the output to be achieved, if they do it in 3 days instead of 5, who cares? If the quality is there, if the output is there, they shouldn't care.
Yeah.
But we don't have the mechanisms really to be able to kind of measure output that effectively. It takes it's a lot harder to do. But again, coming back to the scale in terms of education to get people ready. Ammonia ships coming next year. Standards, we said, kind of coming out now. To scale that up, to get all those people ready for the transition that's coming, hundreds of thousands of seafarers that are going to need training by 2030 and then going on and beyond to that. We have to really think about the quality of those outcomes and how we can do that at scale and at pace to be able to get there. And that's going to require everybody getting comfortable with new models.
Yeah, fully agree. All right, let me give you one quick and finally to wrap things up then. We said we wouldn't, or we tried very hard not to talk about AI today, and then we ended up talking about AI. So now I don't feel too bad about sharing this story. I saw a really interesting job spec go live a couple of days ago. The job is a content strategist, which is, I would imagine, is sort of right up your street, Raoul.
I was going to say I might apply.
Yeah, well, wait till you hear who it's with. Salary $310,000 to $393,000 US. Not bad for a content strategist. Employer, ChatGPT.com.
Wow, interesting.
So my immediate thought was, if ChatGPT is that good, why do they need a content strategist? But it's really interesting if you actually dive into the job spec itself. Effectively, what they're saying is creating the content is one thing, but actually having a strategy around what content's going to be created and what the brand voice is going to look like, and how do you ensure that millions of users get access to like proper emotional intelligence. That still needs a human. It can't yet be done by AI, which I quite liked.
Yeah, but I mean, what is it there? Because it's not like they're generating content, right? It's to generate types of content that people, I don't know, what are they?
Oh, I think it's effectively a marketing role. So they will be generating content, or at least I'll say that, I'll rephrase that. They will be, I'll read directly from the job spec: create, write and edit high quality content from landing pages to guides to campaigns that drive traffic and adoption. Define and evolve ChatGPT's voice and tone across owned web services, ensuring consistency and clarity.
Wow.
Own the content strategy for ChatGPT.com, aligning it to growth, acquisition and product goals. So if ChatGPT still needs writers, there's hope for the rest of us who make a living from writing.
Well, again, like, it's nice to be proved right, isn't it? But like when we talked, that was it really, when we talked about the Superworker episode, where we talked about, like, there is a place for, chef's kiss creativity, for the creatives that will push these mediums. And I think a really good example of that is you could look at like when music went digital. And suddenly, there were people wringing their hands that, like, now you can, you've got hours and hours and hours of expertise to learn how to play an instrument. Then MIDI comes along, and you can kind of create that digital music in terms of DJs taking samples, that kind of thing. The death of the skill of the musician, but a new creativity emerges with people that can then take that technology and innovate with it and do exciting things with it. And again, I think that role there that you described there sort of speaks to that, is that you need that. And certainly my experience of working with ChatGPT, if you want to get out of the bland kind of mush, the gruel, the gloop of terrible content, then you have to be creative in how you work with ChatGPT. You have to push it, you have to challenge it, and you have to think really kind of outside of the box to bring in that spark that will make it something that's really exciting.
Agreed.
Great.
Right. That's the episode.
Yeah, just a quick, by way of an update, just before we close, we have been conducting our guest conversations, let's call them, with the great and the good. We've got a couple in the can, but why, you may ask, are we not putting them out this week instead of Nick and I talking? And it just takes a little bit more time to go through approval processes and all that sort of stuff to get the content ready for you. But they they are here. They're coming, and I'm very excited about what we've done so far.
Yeah, they're good. They're really good. I'm
Mm,
excited to put them into the world.
good stuff. So until next time,
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
cheers. Goodbye.